afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for this generous invitation. Thank you so much, Diego, for the wonderful introduction, a very generous presentation. I'm very happy to be here. You know, I have spent years reading and studying about the Philippines, but this is my very first time in your country, and I'm very excited. I'm terribly excited to be here. So thank you so much for all of you who also made it. And as Diego announced, I'm very pleased to tell you that this is my translation of Nick Joaquin. This is the very first time that Nick Joaquin appears in Spanish. This book was published in November, last November, in Spain, and it is already circulating widely throughout Spain and Latin America. So I would like to formally donate this book to your institution. Perhaps Diego, yeah. Thank you. Okay, and now without further ado, I'm going to proceed with my lecture. I have some notes here, but I'm going to try not to read, okay? Because I think it's always more engaging when lecturers are not reading, right? Today I'm going to talk about Nick Joaquin as a master of the fantastic, of the genre of fantastic literature. That's what I mean. Nick Joaquin is an author who here in Manila doesn't require any presentation or introduction. I assume you are all familiar with him. Major Anglophone writer of the 20th century, who produced his short stories, the ones I translated and the ones I'm going to analyze today, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Right? He also authored 2 novels, theater plays, many essays. I mean, he was a very well-rounded artist and writer, a major writer. Like other Filipino authors of his generation, he was concerned with topics about which he wrote, like the American occupation of the American occupation of the Philippines in the first half of the 20th century, the Filipino diaspora abroad. He wrote on these topics, but there's something that sets him apart from his Anglophone Filipino contemporaries, and that is that Nick Joaquin was a Hispanophile. He had a profound interest in Spanish, in Hispanic culture, and in the Hispanic legacy of the Philippines. That's something very usual, very common among Filipino writers in Spanish, but that's not something that common among Filipino writers in English, okay? If you look at other writers of his generation, like Jose Garcia Villa or F.C. O'Neill Jose, they don't share that passion, that enthusiasm for the Spanish legacy of the Philippines. That's something that sets Nick Joaquin apart. So that interest in the Hispanic legacy of the Philippines is really something that sets Nick Joaquin apart from his Anglophone contemporaries, okay? We shouldn't forget that English was not his mother tongue. He spoke Tagalog and Spanish at home, which was a common combination among the Manila elite that he portrayed so well in his literature. So this is the book that I just donated. This is the Spanish edition of Nick Joaquin's short stories. It has a beautiful painting of the modernist artist Victorio Dades, Modern Mario Clara from 1952. I just saw the painting for the first time live in the National Museum, which made me very, very happy. And these are the 8 short stories that I translated into Spanish. 6 of them take place in the Spanish Philippines in the colonial times. There are two of the most famous that take place in the 19th century, Summer Solstice and May Day Eve. There are 4 that take place in the early colonial times of the Spanish Philippines, like 16th, 17th century. These are the 2 legends and also the Mass of San Silvestre and Doña Jerónima. And finally, the last 2 stories, which are more novellas, really, because they are much longer, take place during the American occupation or even in post-colonial times. So today, I'm going to focus on 2 of the stories that take place in Spanish times. That is the Mass of San Silvestre and the Legend of the Virgin's Jewel, okay? These are two of the most beautiful and also 2 of the shortest stories among the corpus of Nick Joaquin's works. Nick Joaquin is often referred to using the label tropical Gothic, which is a label that he himself coined. So I think we should take it seriously, because he called himself, like he used that in titles of his books. And my colleague and friend Paula Park, in her introduction to this Spanish edition of Nick Joaquin, she writes, of course, she wrote the introduction in Spanish. This is my translation. I'll read the last sentence. She says that tropical Gothic refers to a fusion of Gothic elements, such as an interest in mystery, death, and the supernatural. I've highlighted that in bold, with the tropical environment, folklore, and Filipino culture. I think the supernatural is really, all the elements of the definition are important, but if I had to choose just one to say this is the key Joaquinesque feature, I would say the supernatural component is extremely, extremely important. For this reason, it has become commonplace in the Philippines and abroad to associate Nick Joaquin with Gabriel García Márquez, the creator of magical realism. One of the main objectives of my lecture is to prove that this is a wrong association, okay? I am convinced that this is not the right way of reading Nick Joaquin, okay? I understand that for marketing purposes, given that García Márquez is so famous and popular, it serves well to present Nick Joaquin as a sort of Philippine García Márquez, and this is how he is defined in the back cover of the Penguin edition. However, I'm going to try to argue today that that's not the right comparison. In fact, there's another Hispanic author who is much closer to the sensitivity and to the aesthetics of Nick Joaquin. And I think it is much more fruitful to compare Nick Joaquin with this other Hispanic author than with García Márquez, okay? And the reason for that is very simple. Magical realism, the key feature of magical realism, and you will realize that if you, when you read or reread 100 Years of Solitude, Cien Años de Soledad, is that this is a monograph on magical realism by Maggie Ann Bao, and she says that unless the magical aspects are accepted as part of everyday reality throughout the text cannot be called magical realist. So in 100 Years of Solitude, no one is ever surprised or shocked or amazed by the supernatural, okay? Whenever something supernatural happens, everybody reacts as normal, you know? Like there's a character in 100 Years of Solitude who has a son who is born with the tail of a pig. And he says, I don't mind having piglets as long as they can talk. You know, he's not shocked, he's not surprised. That's the key feature of magical realism. And that doesn't happen in Nick Joaquin. Whenever the supernatural erupts in Nick Joaquin, there's always reactions of amazement, of wonder, of shock, of fear. For this reason, I would say that instead of repeating problematically that Nick Joaquin is some kind of forerunner or precursor of García Márquez, I would suggest that he's rather a master of the fantastic. He's not doing magical realism. He is writing fantastic literature, which is a very ancient genre that had been cultivated by many other writers centuries earlier, García Márquez. And particularly, I would suggest that the key Spanish subtext, the key author with whom we should be comparing Nick Joaquin is Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer. Bécquer is the leading figure of Romanticism in Spain. He had a very short life. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 34. But during his life, he managed to produce a very rich corpus of poetry and legends that actually established him as the canonical figure of Spanish Romanticism. Even though he was born quite late, it's like a belated romantic, but he became the central figure of Spanish Romanticism. Now, I am convinced that this is the key subtext, and this is an idea that I think hasn't been published before, and I'm presenting it here for the first time, so I'm very excited to be able to share my finding with you. I first started to do some research on how and when was Bécquer, the Spanish Romantic poet, read in the Philippines, and I came up with plenty of references. The author of the national anthem, the Philippine national anthem, wrote a poem which is extremely influenced by Bécquer. You have the title on the slide. The next generation, Jesus Balmori, major Filipino writer in Spanish, who wrote the only Filipino novel in Spanish about the Japanese invasion, Los Pájaros de Fuego. He published a book in the early 20th century which has explicit references to Becker, the Spanish Romantic poet. The next generation, Filipino poets who are contemporary to Nick Joaquin, were educated still reading the Spanish Romantic canon. Becker, Espronceda, Zorrilla. And even later Filipino poets in Spanish, Edmundo Farolán passed away last year in 2023, they keep quoting, referencing to Becker. So basically, Becker is a constant on Filipino literature in Spanish from the 19th to the 20th century. And I have, over these 2 weeks I have spent in Manila, I've been able to find plenty of copies of Becker's works in the major libraries of the major universities and in the Spanish casino as well. Okay, but this is still a bit, how can I put it, a bit indirect or tangential. What about Nick Joaquin himself, right? Because he's not a Filipino author in Spanish. Well, I'm very excited to tell you, I'm thrilled to tell you that yesterday, while investigating on the Nick Joaquin's library, which is in University Santo Tomas, I made a little discovery, which is that Nick Joaquin read Becker as well. This is a book of his personal library, an anthology of Spanish poetry. And look at this, the table of contents. There are several works by Becker. And those manuscript annotations are by Nick Joaquin himself. So basically this proves, this is no longer a hypothesis. This actually proves that Nick Joaquin was familiar with Becker. Because, you know, I have examined hundreds of books in the library of Nick Joaquin, and he doesn't take many notes, but when he does take manuscript annotations, it's because he's genuinely interested. And, you know, just judging from the way he draws those asterisks and he encircles the poems by Becker, clearly he found that interesting and compelling. So there's that connection, okay? And not just with Becker, of course. Nick Joaquin was very well read, and he knew all the major Spanish and Spanish-American authors. But for the purposes of my lecture today, this is the connection that I wanted to emphasize. And I'm very glad to tell you that it can be, I think it's a demonstrable influence. So what's the common ground between Nick Joaquin and Becker? I would say there are several points. The first of them is that they were both journalists, okay? We shouldn't forget that. And they both published their stories in the press before they appeared as books. Becker in the Spanish press and Joaquin, obviously, in the Philippine press, but that's something they have in common. They were both profoundly Catholic, and they were both interested in churches. Nick Joaquin wrote several beautiful essays on Philippine Baroque churches, and in his library there are beautiful books about the Philippine architecture of the Baroque. Becker wrote an entire book about the Catholic temples of Spain, so they both have this in common. But their interest in religion goes beyond Catholicism. They were both interested in pre-Catholic pagan mythologies. In the case of Becker, it's an interest in Greco-Latin mythology. In the case of Joaquin, he's interested in the religions and the cults and the rituals of the pre-Hispanic Philippines. And you can see that in the legends of both. Both, given their interest in churches, set many of their stories in Catholic temples, churches, cathedrals, monasteries, abbeys, etc. These are common settings in Nick Joaquin. There's plenty of churches, cathedrals, convents, and the same happens with Becker with the Spanish churches. So this is another element of common ground. Both tend to set their stories in the past. It's an idealized, fantasized past. No? Becker, a 19th century author, sets his stories in the Middle Ages. Nick Joaquin, a 20th century author, sets many of his stories in the early modern Philippines. But they have that in common as well. They look to the past, and therefore the fictions of both tend to have nostalgic atmospheres. No? They feel very classic, very old school, and very nostalgic as well. And finally, it is precisely thanks to that setting in an idealized past that they both introduce the fantastic, the supernatural in the fiction. Whenever they write about their contemporary times, there's no supernatural. It's always in the past. It's always in the Middle Ages for Becker or in the early modernity in Nick Joaquin. And by this, I mean, I want to emphasize my objective is not to claim or reclaim Nick Joaquin as a Hispanic author, far from it. What I want to do is to study how Becker influenced him and how he used Becker as a springboard to create something new, an original and different, something Filipino, right? But I'm just tired of reading about these comparisons with Garcia Marquez. I think they're wrong. I think the right Hispanic author, or the one who's closest to Nick Joaquin, is Becker, and that we should read Nick Joaquin as a fantastic author and perhaps also as a retro-romantic. And by this I mean that, even though he was totally aware of modernism, he was very familiar with the vanguards, with the major writers who revolutionized Western literature in the early 20th century, people like Joyce, Proust, etc. He was familiar with all of that, and yet he preferred to look farther back into the past, to someone like Becker. I find that interesting, and in the conclusion I will elaborate on that. Okay, so there are two short stories I'm going to focus on. One is the Mass of San Silvestre, and as I said, and the other one is the Legend of the Virgin's Jewel. You will remember the Mass of San Silvestre tells a story. It's a beautiful legend. According to it, the Pope, San Silvestre, once per year, on December 31st, he descends from heaven and he performs a supernatural Mass in the Cathedral of Manila, a Mass which is only for the dead. However, according to the legend, if someone manages to witness that Mass, he or she will live 1,000 years. Okay, that's the story. So there's a magician in Manila, 18th century Manila, Mateo de Maestro, who actually wants to live 1,000 years. So he manages to sneak in the cathedral and he hides within an altarpiece, and then he witnesses the Mass. But the Pope, San Silvestre, spots him, and then as a punishment, Mateo de Maestro is turned into stone. Okay, that's the punishment for the desecration. There's a coda at the end in which an American GI, an American soldier, in 1945, even though Manila and particularly the cathedral has been destroyed by the American bombing, he claims to have witnessed the supernatural Mass of San Silvestre, which still goes on despite the destruction of World War II. This is the story in a nutshell, and I would suggest that there is a clear Spanish subtext that we can compare this legend with a legend by Becker. That legend is called the Monte of Souls, El Monte de las Ánimas. And the key thing that they have in common is the eternal repetition of a supernatural rite. No? So in the case of Nick Joaquin, it's every December 31st, there's this supernatural rite, the Mass of San Silvestre. In the case of Becker, it's on All Saints, November the 1st. Every November the 1st, there's this mountain which is covered by, the souls of the dead who are like hunting and trying to, if someone is wandering aimlessly around, he will be captured by those dead souls. No? In the case of Becker, it's a horror story. Nick Joaquin doesn't write a horror story, but still this idea of the eternal repetition is very typical of the fantastic. And also the magical hour is always midnight, okay? That's also typical of the fantastic. It's always in Becker. Whenever there's something supernatural, it's at midnight. And the same happens in Nick Joaquin in this story. There's a wonderful book that I would suggest you to read, which was written by the Romanian historian of religions, Mircea Eliade, who wrote this book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, between 1945 and 1947, which is exactly when Nick Joaquin was writing this short story and when he published this short story. This short story was published, by the way, at the end, like on the December 29th, 1946, just 2 days before San Silvestre. No? That's very typical of Becker as well. If Becker wrote a story that takes place on November the 1st, he would publish it on November the 1st on the press. And Nick Joaquin often did that as well. If there was a date, a significant date on the story, he would publish the story precisely on that date or close to that date in the press. Again, a connection with journalism, a new connection with journalism of both authors. So Mircea Eliade, in this important book, has a chapter about the symbolism of San Silvestre, no? On a New Year, New Year's Eve. Basically, he argues that in many cultures, there's the belief that the end of the year represents the abolition of time, and that the new year, January the 1st, is like the recreation of the world. So the world starts from scratch again. But between the abolition of time and the new beginning of the new year, there's like an impasse. There's a period of time, short period of time, in which the barriers between the dead and those who are alive are turned down, and therefore the dead and those that are alive are able to coexist for a brief period of time. That's precisely what happens in Joaquin's story. This is why I think, I mean, you don't have to read the whole book, but if you could read the chapter on New Year and San Silvestre, I think that that's a very insightful chapter to understand on a symbolic level what is going on in this story by Joaquin. There are many references to time, like San Silvestre is not alone. He is like the leader of a procession from heaven, and there are references to hours on fast wings and the sober days and the angels of the Christian year. And San Silvestre himself is described as time's key bearer. So he has the keys of time, San Silvestre. No? So during this Mass, the Cathedral of Manila becomes the meeting point between heaven and earth, between life and death, between time and immortality. So no wonder the magician Mateo de Maestro wants to be present. This is a very special moment. He's so desperate to be present in the cathedral and get 1,000 years of life that you know what he does? According to legend, only the eyes of the dead can see that supernatural Mass. So he goes to a grave, he takes the eyes of a corpse, the corpse of a saint, and he introduces those eyes on his own eye sockets so that he's able to see with the eyes of a dead. This macabre detail is worthy of Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, there's a story of Edgar Allan Poe called Berenice, in which a character steals the teeth of a woman who's in a grave. No, that's typical Poe, this type of thing. And in fact, I have found during my research in the library of Joaquin, there are at least 3 books with stories of Edgar Allan Poe in his personal library. So I'm sure that connection is there. And again, it reinforces my thesis of Joaquin as a retro-romantic, because Edgar Allan Poe is considered precisely the creator of the dark romanticism in North America. So it's not just Becker. I mean, Joaquin is very well read, and he is like combining all sorts of influences from the Spanish-speaking world, the English-speaking world, and also from his own native Filipino Tagalog culture. There's of course, the topic of the desecration of a sacred space is very important, and I would suggest another parallelism with Becker. Becker wrote a lot about that, you know, during the French invasion of Spain with Napoleon in the early 19th century. French soldiers desecrated many Spanish churches, and in this story by Becker, The Kiss, there's a French soldier who enters a Spanish church and he kisses the statue of a woman, and then the husband, who's also made of stone, is a statue, all of a sudden turns to life and destroys the face of the French soldier with a slap. Okay, I would suggest there's a similar logic here in Joaquin of desecration followed by punishment. But note how he inverts the motif of Becker. In Becker, we have a figure of a stone who turns into life. In Joaquin, we have a figure who's alive, like Mateo de Maestro, who's turned into stone. So it's the other way around, but the motif of the desecration followed by a punishment, and the idea of the stone as well, of the figure of a stone, is present. No? And then, of course, there's one last topic which is extremely important to romantics, and both to Becker and to Joaquin, as a retro-romantic, as I like to call him, which is the topic of the ruins, right? Ruins are a quintessential romantic topic. But once more, Joaquin is not doing like a servile imitation. He's being very creative using this subtext. Basically, in the romantics, and particularly in Becker, the ruins are often the setting for the supernatural. So in this story by Becker, El Miserere, this is about a Spanish monastery which is in ruins, and once per year, magically, it is rebuilt, and there are some souls of monks who fill the temple in order to sing a Miserere, which is a religious song. In the case of Nick Joaquin, it's the other way around. Like Becker starts with the ruins, and the ruins are the setting for the supernatural. With Nick Joaquin in San Silvestre, it's the other way around. We start with the supernatural, with this wonderful procession of San Silvestre and the angels and the archangels and all these wonderful creatures from heaven. And then it's only at the end that we realize all of this is magic. Actually, the reality is that the cathedral is in ruins. The altarpiece has been destroyed. Intramuros has been destroyed. So there's a new inversion, right? In Becker, the ruins are the setting for the supernatural. Joaquin starts with the supernatural and leaves us with the ruins. The very last line of the story is basically a description of these ruins. No? Another difference is that Becker is describing an imaginary monastery that doesn't exist in reality, whereas the ruins of Manila described by Nick Joaquin are painfully real in 1946 for him and for his readers. And the topic appears again, for instance, in the portrait of the artist as a Filipino, his most important play. That play starts with a description of the ruins of Intramuros, right? As for the GI, the American soldier at the end, you might think that his reaction initially might bring the tale closer to magical realism, because he claims that he's not surprised when he witnesses the supernatural mass in 1945. In a letter to the narrator, he says, "I told you about not being surprised. I wasn't." Very cocky, no? I wasn't surprised. I saw this, all of a sudden, the Cathedral of Manila rebuilt with the Pope and everything. I wasn't surprised at all. But later, he says, "I said to myself, what a picture you could take of this to send home." Now, rest assured, no one in Garcia Marquez, no one in Macondo, in 100 Years of Solitude, would ever take a picture of a supernatural event. The fact that he wants to take a picture implies, despite his earlier words, that he finds that extraordinary, right? Because, I mean, I know nowadays we take pictures of anything and everything, right, with our phones. But in the 1940s, you had a limited amount of pictures you could take with a camera. So you had to be very picky of what you photograph. So I don't have any doubt that if he wants to take a picture of that mass, it's because he finds that extraordinary. And therefore, this is in tune with the fantastic, not with magical realism. Move on then to the second story, which is the legend of the Virgin's Jewel. So this is a beautiful story set in 1620 Manila, Santo Domingo, Manila. The protagonist is a friar, a Spanish friar, whose name is Fray Fernando. He has just arrived in Manila. He is very homesick. Everything feels alien to him in the Philippines. He misses Spain. At the courtyard of Santo Domingo, there's a balete tree, and there's a native Filipino, an old man, who every day, every afternoon, places a bowl of milk in front of the tree, okay? Every morning, the bowl of milk is empty. Someone is drinking that milk, okay? Fray Fernando is intrigued, so one night he decides to stay awake and see what's going on with his milk. And then at midnight, the magical hour again, like in Becker, like in the previous story, he sees a huge snake. Magical, it's not a normal snake, it's a magical snake, supernatural snake, carrying a jewel on its mouth, okay? So Fray Fernando, who was formerly a soldier, decides on the second night to fight the snake, and he kills the snake with his sword, and then he takes the jewel and offers the jewel to the Virgin of La Naval, and then he faints, okay? So that's basically the story. In Nick Joaquin's essays contain often very interesting insights about his literature. So if you're writing about Nick Joaquin, if you're studying his short stories, I would encourage you to take a look at his essays again, because they are wonderful. And in this essay, La Naval de Manila, which is I would say is the first important text that he published, I think it's from 1941, he explains how he came up with the idea of writing about this legend. And I find that even another point of common ground with Becker, because he claims that he's just the scribe of an oral tradition, and that's typical of Romanticism. Becker very often says in his legends in Spanish, I'm not inventing anything. This is just a story that I've heard that has been told in Spain generation after generation. And this is exactly what Joaquin is doing here. I'm just the scribe of an oral tradition. There's this reality, this material reality of the jewel, and I'm going to tell you how this jewel ended up here, being in possession of the Virgin. And the story is the story of Fray Fernando. So there's an extremely clear Spanish subtext again in this story. And this is a legend by Becker entitled La Jorca de Oro, the golden bracelet. Okay? The story of Joaquin revolves around a jewel of the Virgin. The story of Becker revolves around a golden bracelet of another Virgin in Toledo, in Spain, but the motif is extremely similar. Now, the motivations of the characters are different. True, not everything is identical in both legends. Because in Joaquin, I would say, brother Fernando, the protagonist, he wants to steal that jewel from the snake in order to give it to the Virgin. And therefore, even though it's a violent act because he kills the animal, at the end of the day, what Joaquin is describing is an act of devotion, right? The case of Becker is a bit more twisted because his protagonist wants to steal from the Virgin. Okay, so it's the Virgin of Toledo has this golden bracelet, and the protagonist, beloved, tells him, "Oh, I'm so jealous of the Virgin. I wish I could have this golden bracelet." So the protagonist, whose name is Pedro, decides to steal from the Virgin. Okay, and of course he's not successful because something supernatural happens. I won't tell you what, but you can read it. All these stories are translated into English. They have been translated for many years, by the way. But clearly, I think the comparison is really extremely clear. There are similar descriptions of the jewel and the bracelet, and particularly metaphors of shining, and also the use of the word moon or moonlight. Joaquin uses the word moon or moonlight 11 times in this story. And this, of course, brings to mind the most famous legend by Becker, which is entitled precisely El Rayo de Luna, so like the moonlight, no, the moonbeam. And finally, both stories have very similar ending because both protagonists faint. Pedro faints after the supernatural punishment in Toledo, and so does brother Fernando in the story of Joaquin. Now, believe me, no one ever faints in 100 years of solitude because of the supernatural. The only character who faints in García Márquez in that novel, in Cien Años de Soledad, he faints because of overeating turkey. Okay, so he eats too much, and as a consequence, he loses sense. But no one faints because of the supernatural. And this brings me to a very important definition of fantastic literature, which was proposed by the Bulgarian but naturalized French scholar Todorov. This is not a literal quotation, I'm paraphrasing, okay? But this is the key idea. Todorov says that he describes the fantastic as the moment of uncertainty when facing the unknown that can potentially lead either towards the explainable real or towards the marvelous supernatural. This is exactly what happens in the legend of the Virgin Jewel when brother Fernando realizes that the bowl of milk is empty every morning. He hesitates. He has this moment of doubt. How come the bowl is empty? Who drinks this milk? Is it an animal? Is it a person? Is it a supernatural being? And this moment of uncertainty, this moment of doubt, ends up leading towards the fantastic, because at the end it turns out that it's a snake which drinks this milk, but not any snake. It's actually like an evil snake, supernatural snake. No? That moment of uncertainty is the key feature of fantastic literature. And I think you will identify it very clearly in several of Joaquin's legends, not only in this one. And what does Maggie Ann Bao says about this in her book on magical realism? This element of doubt and fear of the unknown, of the supernatural, stops the text from being magical realist. No? If there's this doubt, if there's fear, if there's this kind of uncertainty, it's no longer magical realism, because as I have been saying, in magical realism, the supernatural is accepted as normal. There's one character who's called Amaranta in 100 Years of Solitude, who all of a sudden witnesses the apparition of death, and she's not surprised. She says, oh, death looks exactly the way I had imagined it. No? She's absolutely not surprised. That's not what happens with Fray Fernando. He's afraid. He even faints after seeing the snake and later on before the Virgin. So again, another argument, another piece of evidence to strengthen my thesis that Nick Joaquin is a master of the fantastic, but not a magical realist. No matter how much we turn to subaltern studies or post-colonial theory, I think it would be very difficult to offer an anti-imperial reading of this legend. In fact, Nick Joaquin has sometimes been criticized in the Philippines for being too pro-Hispanic, for having a very benevolent view of the legacy of Spanish colonialism and of the legacy of the Catholic religion in the Philippines. In fact, he went as far as saying, I quote, this is from the same essay, La Naval de Manila, the geographical unit of numberless islands called the Philippines, this mystical unit of numberless tongues, bloods, and cultures called a Filipino, was begotten of Spain, is a Spanish creation. And he often elaborates on his essays about the Filipino churches. He establishes the Baroque 17th century Spanish Philippines as the genesis of the Filipino identity. And the reason for that, in his opinion, is that all those wonderful churches and cathedrals and monasteries that you have all around your country, he says these churches were built by Filipino hands. No? So the Manileño is a creation of the Baroque. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree. I'm just explaining what he says in his essays. And I want to emphasize, again, this is another point of common ground with Becker. Becker was not just a writer. He has a whole ideological project, which was to defend the Hispanic and the Catholic legacy of his country, Spain. And the interesting thing about Nick Joaquin is that he's doing something similar with the Philippines. He's defending the Hispanic and the Catholic legacy of the Philippines as the key to Filipino identity. But he's doing that in English, right? That's the twist. Because many Filipino writers in Spanish would agree with these ideas. And there were even Filipino writers in Spanish like Benigno del Rio, who was based in Manila and was published recently by Axel Gasquet. Benigno del Rio would even criticize, like he despised the English language. You know? He wrote in Spanish, which he considered was something much more noble or for higher purposes in literature. And he would show his contempt for English. That's a typical attitude of some Filipino writers in Spanish. But that's not the case of Nick Joaquin. I find that amazing of him. He is defending the Hispanic legacy of the Philippines in English. It's almost as if Becker had written his Spanish legends with French in his mind, right? That, I think, as I said at the beginning, is what sets Nick Joaquin apart and what makes him so interesting. Now, why is he... if he was so well read, if he knew Joyce and Proust and Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot and Lorca and Borges and all the modernists of the first half of the 20th century, why is he writing in this style which reminds us more of the 19th century? Why is he doing that? There's a quotation on the essay which I think might be of help and which will enable me to proceed towards my conclusions, okay? Because I want to give some space as well for questions at the end. Nick Joaquin said, we, meaning Filipinos, we may be said to have leapt straight from the 18th to the 20th century, from the age of romanticism and revolution to the age of politics and anxiety. I find these two words very interesting in the same sentence. Age of romanticism, I have already elaborated on the importance of romanticism for Nick Joaquin. He quotes many romantic authors in his works, Victor Hugo, Byron. He had read all the English romantics, Coleridge, Keats, etc. So romanticism is important for him. He says, but we jump from the age of romanticism to the age of anxiety. Now, if read through the lens of the theory of influence, I think this quotation can give us some insights perhaps, on why he wrote in English. Because it is common to repeat that he wrote in English because he was born during American occupation, and therefore that's the language in which he received his education. But we shouldn't forget, Joaquin left school at the age of 14, you know. He was basically self-taught. So I don't think that his formal education in school necessarily had such a huge influence on him. He got all his extraordinary culture basically by reading in libraries. No? My suggestion goes, or my thesis would go along the lines of Harold Bloom's famous monograph, The Anxiety of Influence, which was published in 1973. It's a theory on poetry, but I think it can also work in prose. What Harold Bloom wrote, basically, I'm summarizing a lot, is basically that every writer is standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Every writer has this anxiety because there are so many great creators on the past before I was even born. How am I going to say something new, something different, something beautiful? And you must remember when Joaquin started to publish his first works in the 1940s, Filipino literature in Spanish had experienced a golden age. I mean, how would a Filipino writer feel in the mid-20th century when you're standing on the shoulders of giants? You have, first of all, the magnificent works of the national hero José Rizal. You have all the other extraordinary 19th century ilustrados, no? Isabelo de los Reyes, Pardo de Tavera, Pedro Paterno. And then you have the magnificent writers of the next generation, particularly Antonio Abad, one of the major writers of Filipino literature in Spanish. So how would you feel? I mean, maybe it is a bit intimidating. You have that legacy. On the other hand, Filipino literature in English was on its infancy in the 1940s. When Joaquin published Three Generations, his first short story in 1941, there were not much had been written about the Philippines or in the Philippines in English. Juan Cabreros Laya published on that very same year his novel, His Native Soil, but that's one of the earliest Filipino novels in English. So I would suggest, apart from the aspect of the formal education, which obviously influenced, that maybe Joaquin found in English a way of an emancipatory feeling almost, no? That a lot has been said about the Philippines in Spanish, but writing about the Philippines in English is something different, something new. It's like a new beginning. And besides, given that he was so familiar with Spanish classics, such as Becker, writing in English was another way of swerving from that influence a bit. Because in the 1940s, the models of Becker were very trite in literature written in Spanish. But following in the footsteps of Becker in English, while incorporating other influences such as Edgar Allan Poe, and setting the fantastic in early modern Manila, wow, I mean, that's something new. That's something different. It hadn't been done before, and it wouldn't be done again after Joaquin. I think that's something quite unique, no? So if we revisit the book of Todorov about the fantastic, he analyzes 24 Western authors in that book. Okay, it's a very influential book, still very quoted, about the fantastic. Of all these authors, half of them are French, 50%. 20% are American, 12% are English, 12% are Germanic, and 1 is Russian, Gogol. I'm not criticizing Todorov. I don't want to be harsh on him. He wrote his classic book with the books that were available to him in the 60s, in Europe, in France. But of course, if we were to write a new introduction to fantastic literature today, I think we should have a broader scope, right? We cannot just write about European and North American writers. Where are the Philippines, Latin America, and Spain? Certainly, later books that have been published about fantastic literature include Spain, and particularly Latin America. And I'm not referring to García Márquez. By now, it should be clear that I don't consider him a fantastic author. He's a magical realist. I'm referring to authors like Borges, who figures prominently in Joaquin's library, or Cortázar, or Bioy Casares, to mention just 3 authors from Argentina. So more recent books on fantastic literature include Spain, include Latin America, but still the Philippines is nowhere to be found. And one of my claims, one of my objectives also with this translation is to make sure that whenever there's a new book, a new introduction to fantastic literature published in the West or elsewhere, we should make sure that Nick Joaquin is present as well, because he's basically a master of the fantastic who can challenge with his creations those of the greatest fantastic authors of the past in Europe, in North America, or in Latin America. So in conclusion, I would say, if I have to summarize my lecture in one sentence, that Nick Joaquin is a master of the fantastic, but he is also a retro-romantic. And by this I mean, as I said earlier, that even though he was perfectly familiar and well-read with all the innovations of modernism, I mean, he loved the poetry of José García Villa, for instance, who is a completely avant-garde. He wrote his famous comma poems with a comma after each word. He knew Joyce, he knew Proust, but still he decided not to follow that path of more formal experimentation and avant-garde, and still he looked farther into the past, into the 19th century. But his was not a servile imitation, as I said earlier. I gave you many examples of how he subverts, how he inverts the motifs in Becker. So basically, by looking at the past, by looking at Romanticism, he managed to enrich a very ancient genre, the fantastic, and he enriched it with his insights on Filipino literature, culture, folklore. So his is an example of fantastic literature which is profoundly based on Filipino culture, history, and religion. Thank you very much for your attention.